Hi, I'm Michael McTear from Ulster University in Northern Ireland. Today I'd like to talk about a project in which we involved users in the design and development of a chatbot for social good. I'd like to begin by talking about how chatbots can have different levels of complexity and what we decided to do in order to reconcile stakeholder requirements with what the technology can actually do. We'll look at ChatPal, which is a chatbot that we developed for mental health support in remote rural areas, looking in particular at how we gathered requirements, how we implemented the chatbot, and then the feedback that we obtained from studies of user experiences with ChatPal. And then I'll finish off by outlining some lessons that we learned from our experiences in the project. Looking at levels of complexity, there are three different dimensions that we can look at. One is interaction, the way the interaction is handled. Then there's modality and language. And then there's the knowledge and intelligence that the chatbot might have. So looking first at interaction, as far as the conversation flow is concerned, we can have simple conversations, which consist of a one-shot exchange, where the user asks a question or makes a command, and the system responds. As opposed to that, we can have multi-turn conversations, and these can be implemented in two different ways. We can have a predetermined conversation flow, that's implemented by drawing a knowledge graph of all the different paths that the conversation is predicted to take. Or we can have a neural dialogue model in which the conversation is generated on a turn-by-turn basis. Then looking at the control within the conversation, we can have a conversation in which the system takes the initiative and asks questions, or alternatively, where the user takes the initiative and asks questions or gives commands, and then there can be a mixture of the two. Looking at personalization, the system may have a persona and may also maintain a model of the user. The conversation can involve a reactive chatbot, which reacts to the user's inputs, or it can be proactive, where it will make announcements or issue reminders, for example, about some upcoming appointment. And then finally, the chatbot can keep track of the conversation, of what has been said and done, in order to provide a context for the subsequent conversation. Looking then at modality and language, as far as modality is concerned, we can have text-based systems, speech-based systems, and multimodal systems, or indeed combinations of the three. As far as the user input is concerned, it can take the form of quick replies or buttons that the user simply clicks on. It can be constrained input, where the system outputs particular prompts. So, for example, please say yes or no. That will constrain what the user will say. Then we can have input that's specific to a particular domain, for example, booking flights, but the system will not recognize anything from other domains. And then finally, we can have the more advanced open domain system, where the user can, in theory, say anything. As far as the system output is concerned, it can be totally predetermined, sentences that the system will output. It can be based on templates, where slots in the templates are filled with things that come up during the conversation. Or it can be totally open-ended, for example, in some of the most recent advanced systems using a large language model. Looking then at knowledge, there may be no integration with any external knowledge, or there can be integration with a database, which is very common, or nowadays with a knowledge graph, or it can be more open, for example, accessing information on the internet to answer the user's questions. The tasks that the chatbot carries out can be simple. Notifications normally don't involve interaction with the user. FAQs, again, can be fairly simple. Slot filling, where the system asks questions in order to get information to conduct a query. There can be Q&A, which can be simple or advanced. And then at the most extreme end, there can be open domain virtual personal assistants that can talk in theory about anything. When creating our chatbot, we had to take three different things into consideration: what the users want and what they say they need on the one hand, then what the professionals advocate as being useful, and then what the technology will allow. And really it's an intersection between the three of these. So looking first now at the ChatPal project, this was a project within the Northern Periphery and Arctic program of the European Union. And the idea of ChatPal was to support and promote mental well-being in rural areas. The areas concerned are on the map marked in dark green. They involved partners from Northern Ireland, Ireland, Finland, Sweden, and the Western Isles of Scotland. ChatPal is multilingual, so it can perform in English, Finnish, Swedish, and Scottish Gaelic. We engaged in very extensive requirements gathering in the first part of the project in order to determine whether a chatbot would be useful for people with mental health problems, and what sort of chatbot would be required. So, for example, the professionals indicated a variety of different aspects, so that it might help in self-management of problems. It might provide an education possibility, training, counseling, cognitive behavior therapy, screening, and diagnosis. Then the users, we had interviews with the users, and they produced what we would call user stories. So, for example, that the chatbot would be useful to give concrete advice for how to handle anxiety and insomnia. That it might be able to measure well-being and sleep disturbance, that it could track moods, that it be a friendly companion that the user could chat with about their interests, and so they feel less lonely, that could ask how they're doing on a regular basis, and that would be friendly, empathetic, and understanding, and be able to follow the user's mental health. And then finally, that it might be able to provide options of different things to do on the user's day off from work. So on the basis of this, then we developed ChatPal. We did not undertake to develop a tool for diagnosis or screening. We thought that was really beyond the scope of the project. And the main aim of the project was to promote well-being, mental well-being, using positive psychology. So to do this, we used a particular approach called PERMA, which emphasizes the following: positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning, accomplishment, and health. We also included a variety of other activities, such as mindfulness and breathing, mood logging, and gratitude and thoughts diaries. And ChatPal was developed using the RASA Conversational AI framework. This is an open source framework, and it can be developed on our own servers, which made it more amenable to various considerations about ethics and privacy. Just very briefly, this is the architecture of ChatPal. So at the front end, we had an interface to mobile phones in Android and Apple iOS. The back end of the system was basically the RASA system, which consists of the natural language understanding component, and the RASA core, which deals with the management of the conversation, also known as the dialogue management. And then there were various repositories and so on for maintaining the data. This is an example then of the interaction with ChatPal. We predominantly used quick replies or buttons, but there was also the possibility for the user to type in a message, which then would be processed by the natural language understanding system. One of the reasons why we kept it fairly simple like this was that we wanted to be sure that we could handle the different languages. We didn't really have the facilities for online translation, and so all of the system outputs were actually translated manually into the languages of the project: Finnish, Swedish, and Scottish Gaelic. And this is actually an example of the use of the languages. The user is invited to choose the particular language they want to use, and in this example, they have chosen Scottish Gaelic, and so the interaction then proceeds in Scottish Gaelic. The interaction was designed using a dialogue tree. We don't need to actually look at the details of this. It's quite complicated, but this was actually broken down into what Raza called stories, which are a declarative way in which the interaction flow can be specified. And so the complete dialogue tree was actually broken down into around 500 different stories. And then when ChatPal gets an input from the user, it would classify that input as an intent. There were around 180 intents in the project, and the intent would be interpreted as part of the story. And this would then all come together in a coherent conversation. So it's not the case that the stories were actually implemented as a complete dialogue tree. They were implemented as minor parts of the tree, subtrees of it. And then these then came together during the actual interaction. Now, looking at some of the results, this is a diagram that's setting out the percentage of users that access different elements of the chatbot conversations. So at the very top, we have, for example, treat yourself like a friend, relax, thoughts diary, and so on. Another set of results is showing basically the ratings of the conversation. So by and large, most of the different types of conversation were rated fairly well. We actually had a lot of different statistics that were compiled from analyzing the logs of the interactions, and also interviews with the participants. So here, for example, we see how the extent to which the participants felt that the chatbot actually changed their mental well-being. In this case, we had 98 participants. And as we can see, the picture is fairly good. If we combine significantly improved and slightly improved, we get a score of 52%. There was still quite a lot who said unchanged, and then a fairly small amount who said slightly worse, and then significantly worse. We also then took objective measures using a variety of different scores. For example, the short Warwick-Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Scale, the World Health Organization 5 Wellbeing Index, and the Satisfaction with Life scores. These were taken across the trial period. And again, you can see that against the baseline, there was an improvement in the scores for the participants in these different measures. So this was a fairly good feedback. We also looked at some of the feedback that we had from the stakeholders and the implications of these. So, for example, one of the issues was that the users of the chatbot were more likely to be female, and so it was suggested that perhaps future applications could adapt more to the gender of the user to make it more appealing. Of course, this then involves developing a user model. Gender would be one aspect of that model, but there could be other aspects as well, such as preferences and so on. And that, of course, would make the system much more complex. Another comment was that there was a high drop-off rate, and that one of the things that could mitigate that might be that the system might be more spontaneous and be able to remember the last conversation and mood, and generally develop a personality. So again, there's quite a lot that would be involved in that. First of all, being able to remember previous conversations and aspects of those. That actually conflicted to some extent with users who wanted to maintain privacy and protection of their data. And the idea of developing personality, of course, would also be more difficult to maintain as well. There was a conflict between those conversations that were the most used and those that were not necessarily the best liked. So again, there was the suggestion of more adaptation based on what the user feedback would say. That might involve then changing the order of the conversation. Again, that's quite a complex thing to do in terms of developing much more flexible stories, but it is actually still possible to implement that within the RASA system. A fairly simple one in this case, that the user moods were only collected at the start of the session, and it was recommended they should also be collected at the end of the session. That wouldn't be too difficult to incorporate. And then finally, there was the issue of the WHO well-being questions that were asked, that no feedback was provided. Again, that wouldn't be too difficult to actually maintain a record of that and then retrieve the information to feed that back to the users. So all in all, there were some recommendations that would be fairly easy to implement and some that would be more difficult. So what lessons did we learn from our experience of developing ChatPal? Well, we found that chatbots can be developed at different levels of complexity. In our case, we took a fairly simple approach to the natural language understanding of the user's input. This was mainly because we had to develop the chatbot in different languages, and we didn't have a dynamic runtime translation system available to us. So we used the simpler approach of quick replies and buttons, and this could all be easily translated beforehand into the different languages involved in the project. Well, then we found that actually we have to resolve conflicts between user requirements, what users expect and would like, with the capabilities of the technologies available. User involvement is essential throughout the development process and in the subsequent evaluation. This was particularly useful both in planning the project in advance and then in deciding and determining to what extent we have been successful. And then finally, there is the issue that users can be inconsistent in their expectations. Many users have experience of advanced conversational assistants such as Amazon Alexa or Google Assistant, and they may expect more from a project such as this than is actually possible. On the other hand, it may be the case that they actually don't realize what can be achieved with current technology and that their expectations are lower than what actually could be done. So it's important really to reconcile really the user expectations with the capabilities of the current technology and what can be done. With that, I would like to thank you for listening. Goodbye.